Hi, I'm Kyle Brown, lead educator with Catalyst ED, and I'm going to talk today about mapping your local environment. And our objective here is to create a map of your local environment using natural materials as data. So the materials that you're going to need for this project are an eraser, a pencil, a piece of paper, and then also something to color with. You can have colored pencils, markers, or even crayons. The essential questions that we're going to ask is, why do we make maps? What is the reason for exploration? And how do we use natural materials as data? So the first step is going to be gathering your data, which is your natural materials. You want to walk around your yard or your neighborhood safely and collect natural objects like twigs, like leaves, or maybe something that surprises you, like a feather. One of the main things you want to do is actually notice and be aware of your surroundings. Are you finding common objects? Is there something more interesting to you? Are things arranged in piles, or are they separate from one another? What patterns do you notice about where you find your objects and what you find? Scientists in the 1500s and 1600s collected a lot of natural materials to advance knowledge about natural science. This is a lot of where our objects come from that are in natural history museums and how we've mapped the world. So step 2 is that you're going to be going back into your lab or your studio with your natural objects and materials. You're going to need your pencil and your paper. So what I've collected here, I've collected a twig, I've collected some leaves, and I've collected some acorn caps. Something that you might want to do before you start making your map is actually observe the objects. Think about what you see, look closely. Something that scientists used to do is something called scientific illustration. And this is a way of drawing and observing your objects by looking closely, noticing patterns, and seeing what you can discover. It's a great way to see what you have and even compare. For instance, these are 2 acorn caps, yet they look totally different. So at this time, you might want to actually do a little sketching of your objects. Think about the colors. You can choose what colored pencils you might want for later. Next, what you're going to do is you're going to take your objects and you're going to arrange them on the page. Now, this is where I want you to think again about how you found them and any patterns you saw. So I noticed that this branch, which you can see also has an acorn cap on it, was near the other acorn caps. So I'm going to arrange it in a way that demonstrates that. Whoop. The same for these leaves. They were also a little piled together, so I'm arranging them, I'm grouping them in a way that shows that. And I also have some rocks that were a little bit farther off, so I'm going to put them away. So this is my data, and this is a preliminary grouping of my map. And taking on the lens of, say, a map maker, or we also call a cartographer. It's okay that they're overlapping. We actually want them to overlap because it'll create more interesting forms. The next step after this is to actually trace the objects where you have them laid down. This can be a little bit tricky, especially for things like leaves or branches. So make sure that you might want to hold down the object with one hand and try carefully to trace with another. If you don't get it exact, it's really okay. And again, I'm not tracing around the entire object. I'm going with where I've placed them sort of grouped together. When I'm done with one section, I can take it away, and then I can move on to the next. So once I've traced it all, I can remove my objects and see what I've come up with. So you can see here is my acorn caps. I actually added another leaf, so I wanted to take it up a little bit more space. And you see again my rocks over here, and you'll see how they're grouped together. The next decision that I want to make is putting the hat of, say, a map maker or cartographer on, is to think about what lines I want to keep and what lines I don't. So when I think of lines, I might think of boundaries, right? If we're thinking about maps, what lines are my boundaries? And then you might want to decide, well, are my boundaries between different landforms? Are my boundaries between water and land? So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to trace around the edges, a little bit darker, the lines that I know that I want to keep. You don't have to know exactly what you're doing with your map at this time, but just notice how they're grouped, the objects are grouped together, which shapes you like the best that they've formed. If for some reason before this step you decided, oh, I really don't like this arrangement, it's okay, do it again. We've collected a lot of data with the natural materials, and they can be arranged in many different patterns and many different orders. So here's my outline, beginnings of my map. The next step that I'm going to do is think about the lines that I don't want. And this is where my eraser comes in, and I'm actually just going to erase the lines that I don't want. The next part is going to be a lot to do with your own creativity and inspiration. It's also a good time to maybe take a break and look at some maps. There are topographical maps, there are nautical charts, there are maps that show more urban landscapes. I myself grew up on the ocean, and I've seen a lot of nautical charts as a child, so I'm constantly influenced by that form of mapping. So when I look at this, what I see is perhaps bodies of water and also land. So for me, the distinction of this line would be between land and water. And I really like the look of this shape to think of, well, maybe that could be somewhat of a river or an estuary leading out to a bigger body of water. So I'm deciding that these forms are going to be bodies of water. And because I'm familiar with something like a nautical chart, I also know that there are lines within the bodies of water that show different depths. So that's going to be my next step, is I'm going to add a little bit more and embellish this map to make it feel more like a nautical chart. So I'm going to go in and kind of trace around the shapes that are already there. You can do this in your own way. So the next step for me would be to think about color. All right, what colors are going to help me create an interesting map, or one that showcases what I'm trying to show? So which is the water and the land. So I have my colored pencils. I have different shades of blue. I have different shades of green. And I also have some yellow and brown that I might use for the land. So I'm going to start by starting to color in these different areas. And again, you have your map already figured out or partially figured out once you get to this point. And I'm going to keep going. Keep coloring. Something else you can do if it's helpful, you could also put X's where you know you want the color to be. So for instance, I know I want my darkest blue to be in here. I'm kind of marking that so it doesn't get confusing with the lines. And I know I want it to be green out here with the start of the land. And then I can keep coloring it in, and then also thinking about little details I might add along the way. So I'm going to show you what I worked on to create a more final piece of the map. As you can see, this is very different from what we started with. And I find it really interesting that I created this piece using materials and data that I collected from my backyard. So it becomes a more imaginative map. And it gives us a sense of how maybe cartographers or map makers and explorers felt, back in the 15 and 1600s when the world was undiscovered, and how we as humans interpret the places around us. So as you see here, I've created different colors that mean different things to me. I've created dashes for different boundaries. I've also made X's and squiggly lines. And now I understand this, but you probably don't. So the last thing is going to be to create a key for your map. I realize one thing that I would like to add is to show something where people might be, like where is a town? So I'm going to think of a symbol. I think I'm going to do a little house symbol, and I'm going to create that symbol in places where I think people might inhabit. And this is another way to also understand your map. I'm thinking, well, people want to be near this body of water. Okay? And I can keep going and pushing this and create my own imaginative map based on what I'd like to see. So the final step, like I mentioned, is creating a key so not just you, but other people can read your map. So this is the key for my map, as you can see here. I have the light blue for shallow water. I have the medium blue for medium depth water, and the dark blue for deep water. And again, I've used dark green and light green to show different levels in elevation and topography. I also have the dashed line to show different boundaries within the water, and the X to show the highest elevation of the land. So what I need to add next is the house, so I can show where there's a town. So now I've completed my map with the key, so I can understand it, but also others can too. So I hope this inspired you to put on your scientist hat, map maker hat, and artist hat to use creativity, but also data from your backyard to create something interesting and inspirational.